Hi everyone, it's Paul at Racing Vincent here. It's April 2022 and it occurs to me it's been quite some time since I last did a video. Those that did have a look at the time may remember that back in 2020 when we were in lockdown, I started work on a 1939 Manx project which I've got, which is a very nice project to have, but it was also for another purpose. I wanted to use it as a chassis to hold our an engine that had our own crankcases. So quite a few years ago I'd made the patterns for the single overhead cam type Manx crankcases, which were very different to the intercrank cases, and one of the main differences that they were cast from magnesium originally. Because of that, original single knocker crankcases for Manxes in magnesium very hard to come by, and frankly there's very few people would want to run one of those engines at full bore now, as magnesium tends to get a little bit brittle. So I've always been interested in making them. It took a number of years to put the patterns together, which I have to say are beautiful, to retrospectively do the drawings, which took me probably 2 years alone, working through weekends in the days when I was doing another full-time job, and those drawings were slowly put together based on having 2 or 3 original sets of crankcases. What was interesting at the time was I was fortunate to have a set of genuine pre-war crankcases and 2 sets of post-war crankcases. And although the crankcases look very similar, there are subtle differences between the two. And as at the time I was having the patterns professionally made, I was able to incorporate the key differences between pre-war crankcases and post-war crankcases. And the result of that being, I had 2 trial sets of crankcases made, one being a pre-war type and the other set being an immediately post-war type, both 500cc, both of them for M30 as the competition engine was originally called, but later became known as the Manx Norton. So that's probably 5 or 6 years ago now, and having had that first set cast and looking beautiful as a set of castings, with a friend of mine who's at the time was working in the aeronautical industry, machining similar sort of castings, we took upon it to do the setup and writing the CNC programs to machine these. And the first set of those finished probably 3 years ago. A lot of water's gone under the bridge since, but I've been meaning to assemble that into an engine and to trial run it. Originally, I was looking to put it into a different bike, just as purely a test engine, but I've got this 1939 pre-war Manx project, which most of it was there, and one of the things I'm missing was crankcases. So it made sense to build the engine into that bike. So originally I built the engine to the intention was to build it to approximately 1938 spec. But the Garden Gate pre-war Manx didn't come through till 1939. So effectively that's the year of this bike, 1939. I suppose if I'm chasing a point, I'd be interested to know when the Garden Gate was first produced, whether it was late 38, replacing the earlier sprung chassis, of which only a handful were made, and they're classed as a big plunger Norton. Whether the Garden Gate actually did come along in 1938, which is, I don't know why, but I'm putting this engine as around 1938 spec. or whether they were actually only introduced in 1939. But anyway, you may have seen a couple of earlier videos I did back in 2020, where I showed you the assembly of the frame, some of the parts around it, and when I finished off those videos back then, I was just in the process of doing the rear suspension for plungers, and actually I had a set which were from that which was still in good condition. They just needed some gentle refurbishing and cleaning up, and at that point I did some more work on the chassis which I hadn't put into a video. So I thought what would be good first, before moving on to the engine, it would be good to do a short video, this video, first of all just to show you where I left off with the bike. But as I started to look at it and was thinking about how I was going to do that, I thought it might be a good idea just to show some of the differences between the different competition and road camshaft Nortons of that era. So it's not really a history lesson going all the way through, but it perhaps gives some context to this bike and this engine. So going through some of the photographs of the time then, having restored the plungers, I knew that one of the top plugs was damaged, so I needed to make some plugs anyway. Here's a plungers before it actually started restoring. This is from a second frame I've got, but I knew I needed to make some plugs, and the original ones were made in aluminium. So I got hold of a very good quality plug, and I was able to measure the inside of a spindle and get a tolerance because they're tapped in so that they don't come out, obviously. And there's a distinctive profile to the original ones. So I picked the nicest one I could, and I made a CNC program to do a batch of plugs, been meaning to do it anyway, so that I could fit the one in one of the two missing missing ones from the plunger frame. So here they are when I was actually finishing making a batch, and they did go on the website. They're on the website along with the other suspension parts, and the missing one I was able to fit in one of the new ones I'd made. So here we are just fitting it, and I cleaned out the bore of the original spindle first, ready to take the new one, and it was simply a case of carefully tapping it in with a mallet, just making sure first that the mallet didn't have any bits of swarf or anything on its mallet head, because otherwise that'd go into the alloy. You'll see there's a screwdriver slot underneath on the spindle itself. Never been quite sure what that is, but I assume it's to help rotate the spindles when they're actually in situ, undo the top bolt, the clamp that holds them, and it allows them to move around. But if I'm truthful, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's when you tighten the bottom bolt, it's to stop them spinning by holding them with sync secure. This is one of the original two plugs that was in, and you'll see here's a pair of them together. So I did get one of the original plugs, and actually having a few marks and knocks on it gives it character, but the other plug was replaced. So just before moving on to springs, this picture here of the inside of the brake side plunger slider, and it shows the distinctive slot on the inside for the brake plate stop. So the brake plate on a plunger garden gate plunger was quite different to the brake plates fitted to rigid and swinging arms, in that one of the two pins that held the brake shoes were riveted to the plate. One of those two on a plunger has a very distinctive square, and that square slots into the slot that you see there. So if you're ever on eBay and you're looking for a brake plate for a rigid, and you see one that has a square on the outside pressed steel brake plate, then it's from this type of garden gate frame. So just before we move off this photo, for the really anal, the garden gate plunger was made from 39 all the way through to the early 50s, 1950s, on most of the single cylinder models, including the Manx. But actually, the Manx for 1949 introduced the conical rear hub, and that conical rear hub was a beautiful brake magnesium, but that hub was pretty much universally known for being fitted to the featherbed. But actually, in the first year, it was fitted to the garden gate, 1949, and the brake plate was actually a great deal different to the earlier pressed steel brake plate, as well as being a casting. The shoes were much bigger, therefore it wasn't just it was conical, it actually was a much more powerful rear brake. But being fitted to the garden gate, those very first conicals, although looking the same as the ones fitted to a featherbed Manx Norton, actually if you look carefully at the brake plate, you'll see they have that same square peg that the earlier press steel items had, because it still had to fit into this casting as shown here. Very, very unusual to find one. I don't think you'll ever find one in an auto jumble, but those very first conical brake plates were slightly different to the featherbed ones in that they had a square peg on them. I'm fortunate to have one because I'm fortunate to have a 1950 Manx with a conical rear hub, and the brake plate, as I say, is slightly different. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on to the next bit and talk about springs and covers. So I did have a set of springs for this garden gate. I've actually got 3 garden gate project bikes, and I've got a set of plungers for each of them and original springs. But if there's a lot of Norton owners who have got plungers would know they've ever stripped the plungers down. The springs do tend to wear where they're touching the outer covers, and vice versa. The covers wear when they're touching each other in the springs. So it's not unusual if you ever strip a plunger down to find either the springs, well, maybe both, the springs being worn and part of its circular coil section has been worn away, which obviously will weaken the spring but also make it slightly less effective. And the covers tend to wear, they become very, very thin at their extremities, and eventually they start to wear away. I've got lots of original chromed covers which are going rusty, and on their inner face they've quite often will have actually worn away and eroded until they're no longer a straight line. So I was in this position with a set of plungers. I did have a set of springs, but I could see that they had part of their section worn away where they always tend to. And actually, just prior to working on this chassis, I'd actually decided to make those springs. And to do that, I actually went to another of my frames. And I've also got a 1947-48 Manx in bits, and that has still got its original plungers in place from when I bought it many, many years ago. It's actually a genuine sidecar Manx chassis, and it's to fit a 600cc engine. But when I bought it from a previous owner many years ago, I was told it had come like that, and actually I don't think they'd ever stripped the frame down. So the nice thing was about those rear plungers, I'd had the bike for many years but never stripped them. I've not got to that project yet, but I knew that the springs are likely to be the original springs and never have been stripped down. So you can see here, I did strip the plungers down. I need to do it to work on that frame, to do a bit of work on the rear plunger area anyway. So 2 or 3 years ago I stripped that frame down, take out the springs, and I knew therefore those springs would be definitive original. Norton springs, and they certainly seem to be. So from that I had springs copied and sets made. They're available on the catalogue, but like I've done with so many parts for this particular rebuild, I took a set for myself, and they're the springs that are going in it. They're not currently fitted, and I do need to do that. That's one of the tasks coming up shortly. But springs were put aside, and the next thing were covers. So as you can see with the photograph here, with these springs, also the original covers, which I believe to be Norton. They were painted, as far as I know, the chassis was painted green sometime probably in the late 50s or early 60s. And the covers are also green, or ones which were painted. And that gave me a good set of original ones. I've actually got 2 or 3 sets of original Norton ones, all badly worn, all rusty. So we made a batch of those in stainless steel. It seemed pointless making just for ones which will be polished in stainless steel, so I made all of them in stainless steel. Not an easy job. The supplier the manufacturer that made them for me has been making them for many years, but he's close to retirement, and they were a beautiful thing. Since originally having these made back in, I think it was around this time, late 2020, 2021. The first batch is actually now entirely sold out, which I'm sorry to say, but I am looking to have another set made. He's in semi-retirement now, the man that made them for me, but I am hoping to have another set made later on in perhaps autumn 2022. But as you can see from the photograph, I also, at the same time as having those made, I had one full set of those made for this bike. I haven't painted the ones which need to be black yet, and that will be done at the same time as fitting them. I'll have a few other items to paint black at the same time. But that then gave me the complete set of springs and covers as per the original spec to go in. So that covers those. Not fitted yet, but they are complete. So just before I finish off on the rear plungers, I just want to talk quickly about a couple of other parts I made back at the time. First of all, just at the bottom of the plungers, there's quite a distinctive bolt. It's about 1 inch long. It's quite a substantial bolt, and it threads into the bottom of the rear plunger spindles. And those rear plunger spindles, as you've seen from earlier, are tapered at the bottom. And there's a corresponding taper in the bottom lugs of the garden gate plunger frames. And the idea is that when those plungers go in, with all the springs and alloy sliders fitted, the last thing before you tighten the clamp at the top of the plunger casting is that you ensure that the spindles are fully pulled down into the taper and fully locked. And to do that, this substantial but not very long bolt is screwed in from the bottom and fully tightened. And there's actually quite a bit of effort to do that. And I think that that's probably why there is a slot in the top of the spindles, to try and just help that by stopping them from spinning. But what is interesting about that bolt at the bottom, first of all, it has a quite distinctive head shape to it. It's kind of curved. And I've got original Norton ones of that, and they have this distinctive curve. They're cadmium or dual nickel plated steel on the originals, and actually the head isn't that brilliantly finished. You know, it's not a polished finish. It's quite workmanlike. But it's got a distinctive head. But what is interesting is the washer that's fitted, because it's not really a washer, it's more like a spacer, and it's very substantial, it's very thick. And the reason for that being because the amount of effort to pull those spindles fully down into the casting, for tapering the casting, is quite an amount, and a normal washer would flex and bend and probably not pull them down properly. You sometimes, I've stripped them and found that just normal washers are fitted, but the original Norton washer was a very substantial washer. So, as I always do, I've been meaning to make a batch of those as well. So that was another one done a year or two ago. We made a batch of those. They do look very pretty in stainless and with the head polished. Unfortunately, nobody will really see them because they're right at the bottom, but it's nice to know that they are there. So again, another set of those got waylaid. I also had the very thick spacer, washer, whatever you want to call it. I had that replicated, laser cut in stainless steel, just like in linish to remove the sharp edges you get on laser cutting. I linish them, but they are nice. So a pair of the bolts and the washers were put to one side for those spindles as well. And then the last bit was the rear chain adjusters. And like so many things on garden gates, they were specific to that frame, specific to that design of plungers. It's quite a simple but elegant design to ensure that the rear wheel was adjusted for the chain adjustment was done in line, and it consists of a single press cut kind of pair of washers joined in the middle by a strip of bar, but pressed so that the washer went one on either side of the alloy casting. And as I'm describing this, should be a picture in front of you what they look like. And you can see that you've got a washer on one side and a washer on the other, joined in the middle by a square or rectangular strip of steel. And that rectangular strip of steel was a nice size fit in the slot of the alloy sliders. And they are sided, so one side has a larger hole than the other because the plunger rear wheel spindle was also specific to plungers. Not a picture of that yet, but I'll show that later in the build. So then in the centre there was effectively an adjustment bolt, but if you look carefully you'll see that the head of that bolt was also square to fit, as you can guess, into the slot. And the idea being, when you adjusted the two nuts at the end of the chain adjuster, the adjuster bolt couldn't spin round because it was being held against the slot in the castings. So simple but effective. There were then two cups, and those cups, the original Norton ones, just fit over a milled circular casting where on the alloy sliders they just tap over it beautifully. You get an original Norton cup and it will just tap on lovely. It's got a nice feel to it as it just goes on. Quality. And even the nuts, you'll notice that the first nut is larger than the second lock nut, and that was just a simple thing to make it less likely that you're going to round the faces of the two nuts because you needed different spanner sizes. So you'd normally use an open-ended spanner on the larger nuts, which actually did the adjustment, and then go in with a lock nut while you're holding the larger nut in its position. But the spanner of a lock nut, and I tend to use an open-ended on a large one and a ring spanner on the smaller one, it wouldn't slide off the lock nut. The smaller spanner wouldn't slide off the lock nut onto the larger nut and round the face off. It's only a simple thing, but it was a nice design. So I have got a couple of new old stock originals of these. Quite a few actually. Either new old stock or only very lightly worn. But I've been meaning to make these up for some time anyway, a batch of them. So I completed the plating of the press steel pieces. I did consider many years ago getting those made in stainless, but actually it's very difficult to get things pressed in stainless without them marked, and then it's very difficult to get the marks out. So with things like that, it's often easier just to get them in steel and then get them satin nickel plated. But the other fittings that you'll see there were parts I have CNC made, either myself or people I used to CNC make stainless. The cups look very much like petrol tank cups, but again, when you compare them side by side, because we already make the cups for petrol tank fittings underneath the petrol tanks that hold the rubbers, you'll find that these are actually slightly larger. So these are specific for the garden gates. So as part of making a batch, again, one set of them got held to one side. And although they're loosely fitted, they won't get final fitted until I fit the rear wheel. So that about covers it for the rear plungers. As I say, I didn't do it at the time, but most of this work was done late 2020 into early 2021. And perhaps not in chronological order, because at the same time I was also looking at the front end. And I think that will be the next video, just covering what I did on the front end with the girder forks. Okay.